But after, for instance, after 47 days, the estrogen cycle shuts down. After 123 days, the testosterone cycle shuts down. So not only is reproduction affected by people going underground, but also the hormonal balance they have is affected, and you end up getting all kinds of medical conditions in a short order. But we do have the language, so people are certainly going to try it.
Nice.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Let's stop for a second. You wanted to know about important stuff. It just dawned on me that some of the things I should mention here, especially about the going underground, is that we actually are seeing the signs of the visibility of it show up now through sort of back channel stuff. I happen to have been made aware that some of the celebrities are starting to freak out. I'm sure everybody saw the George Lucas Thinks the World Ends in 2012 article that was out on the internet. Well, as a result of, or not as a result of that, but concurrent with that, I also became aware of apparently a sizable number of, if you want to call them the celebrity community, on the order of perhaps 1 or 2 or 3% of people we may put into that category are actually going to the trouble and expense to get involved with underground survival shelters, either purchasing them or buying rights into them. And this has been rather shocking to some people that are also in like the movie business. So I've happened to find out about it through law enforcement, because some of the law enforcement guys are actually being hired away from their law enforcement jobs by offers of money they can't refuse. And what they find themselves doing is escorting goods primarily into underground bunkers that they didn't know existed in odd places, for instance, like Southern California. At that level of visibility is starting to break out. When we start seeing it as a routine sort of thing in the mainstream media, then all of a sudden it'll go to a very quick level of visibility and everybody will be discussing it. But at that point, again, it shows up in the data as being almost concurrent with events that would tend to bring about hiding underground. So by the time everybody's discussing it in the mainstream media, it'll probably be the day before we get a big burst of unknown energies from space that fry a bunch of people or something along those lines.
With the caveat that if the internet's still up, I guess.
Correct, yes.
Yep. Okay, we've got a question here from Groundrod in regards to processes. Groundrod?
Yeah.
Clif. I in regards to the internet going down and sitting around the campfire thinking about things, I've tried to come up with a question to ask you that would be fun to think about. And since September 2008, I've been convinced asymmetrical language trend analysis is a proof all humans are psychic. Could we do more to specifically to define that, future viewing, presentiment?
Yeah, well, okay, there's a couple of different things to think about there. I mean, curiously, there's these devices that you can buy now as programmers that are like headsets and allow you to write software that react to brain waves, which is really cool. And I've got one of them. I don't know if I'll ever have the chance to experiment with it, but it's actually if you will, an acknowledgement on the part of the technology industry that it's possible to change material reality with thoughts. Because basically they're saying you put on this little headset and someone writes some code, and if you light up this little electron by thinking this particular way and it causes this particular sensor to fire off, then certain things can occur. And that is not that big of a stretch to then go from the idea of basically a local psychicness. You go and think about green banana pudding, and it gets a particular electrode to fire off on this headset that's sensing your brain patterns, and then you use that to write the word Fred in the software. A rather obtuse way of getting around to it, but it is basically what goes on with humans now. Now, I've often wondered in looking at the language whether it could actually be one of two ways. I describe it as thinking that we're all antennas wandering around, and these waves come rolling through reality, which we all pick up, and we vibrate in sympathy to if we're tuned to pick up that vibration, and then that vibration has to be released by us somehow, and so we just choose, now that the internet is available, to be able to release it in the language so that we invoke the archetypes, and it sort of gets out of our system. So in other words, you're just sitting there and you've got an anticipatory feeling that there's going to be an earthquake, and sure enough, 4 or 5 hours later there is an earthquake. But before the earthquake arrives, because of the psychic pressure, if you will, on your antenna sitting there vibrating at a higher frequency in part of your mind, you have to express it. So you get online, whether it was your habit or not, and you just manifest the pre-knowledge of the earthquake several hours ahead of things by choosing specific language within a regular sort of a conversation that you may have. And in terms of the process, if we happen to be sweeping, we catch that. What would be really cool would be to do it on a real-time basis. And indeed, the government, with the large supercomputers, may be trying that sort of thing. But in remote viewing, I don't know. Remote viewing has a protocol, a discipline to it, sort of like a specific set of things you have to do in order to be able to have it be effective and accurate. Whereas what we're doing here is more like, I don't know if there is an analog, if that makes sense. Remote viewing I've seen, and it's been surprising. There are no secrets. If someone wanted to drill down and look at my code with remote viewing, I'm certain that it could be done if they had the technique and they were talented and so on, and it apparently was so successful that the government invested a lot of money in it and continues to do so to this day. But I don't know that I would call our stuff that. It's more of a goulash, whereas remote viewing would be specific recipe. And the goulash for us is just whatever happens to be lying around. That, I think, actually accounts for a lot of the stuff we get that doesn't pan out, or we're not sure if the data set is stopped and therefore it's going to manifest, because we get these gaps where the data will come on in and it'll stop, and we think, oh, okay, we're within a certain period of time, depending on how it stops, of manifesting, and then 3 months later, after the stuff should have happened, all of a sudden the data set starts gathering more data and linguistics under it. And in the end, it's actually turned out that those data sets have been well worth paying attention to, but they've been very confusing. Specifically, the one I'm thinking about was the tsunami, because we had the 6-month lead time between the earlier earthquake, which was the one that interrupted the Peterson trial, and then the Sumatran tsunami, which occurred 6 months later. But the data sets were basically the same, but there was a slight gap, and then all of the data really came tumbling in on the tsunami afterwards. Sorry to be rambling off on that. It's always really puzzled me about why the data just suddenly stops and apparently doesn't continue to support, and we think it's going to trigger, and then it picks up again.
Great, thanks. Ma'am, you have a question for Clif?
Yes, Clif. In the report you mentioned knowing self. Is it more important now than ever before to be mentally prepared?
Well, or crazy, to the point where you just don't care. Seriously, there's a lot to be said for that. The mentally prepared stuff, you need to be real flexible about it, because it may also be a situation of if you're affected by any of the magnetism or any of the other weirdness, you'd be going along and you think, well, as an example, I was down in Mexico City. I was doing a job where I had to do some instruction in Power Builder, which is a particular language that allows you to connect front-end stuff to the back-end databases relatively quickly for commercial applications. And I had to do this in Spanish and Spanglish, we called it, to a primarily Mexican audience in La UNAM, this university. And I go down there with this nice guy who has arranged this whole software gig. I meet him the day before. He goes to the hotel, very nice hotel, just ancient, 400 years old, giant brick or huge stone blocks. And this guy is from Texas, and we had an international crew that assembled in Mexico. We all get together, do our consulting gig, and then we would all fly home. This is kind of how that business worked. Anyway, so I'm sitting there with him for breakfast the day before we're supposed to, or the day that we're actually, that morning we're going to go on over to the university and start teaching. And this is probably 7 or something in the morning. I don't think it was much later than 8. And we're having breakfast in the restaurant at the hotel, and he looks at me and he says, "I think I'm going to faint." And I was kind of looking at him like, "Hey guy, we're having an earthquake." That's why you feel odd. But it was, and I knew we were in the midst of a very large earthquake. It turned out to be an 8.1. It was horrific in a lot of regards. But what still sticks with me to this day was his interpretation of what was going on. He had no context. He had no frame of reference. And so he felt these waves going through him and saw the room moving and the table moving and stuff, and he totally internalized it and thought that there was something going on. At the time, he told me later on, he said he thought he was going to have a heart attack and or that he was going to vomit and then faint. And he wanted to tell me this somehow as though it was going to make a difference. But it's rather odd. So I would not put that kind of experience out of our potential future. Because if you're driving your car and all of a sudden the road seems to be twisting and your hands don't seem to quite work and this kind of thing, it may be that your brain is experiencing a magnetic disturbance, and the thing to do is to recognize this and not ignore it, and therefore get off the road and shut the engine off if you're capable of doing it. Only offering that as an example, but that's the kind of crap that we see in the language. We've had for a number of years this postulate that George Ure came up with that said basically the longer we see something developing, the broader its impact on the population as a whole. And to a certain extent, I think his postulate is correct. And so we have evidence we can cite that makes us think that this is the case. So for a number of years now, we've had this weird image show up in the detail layers of people actually walking across the street in some city and being struck dumb, as the phrase goes, by whatever, whether it's a magnetic anomaly or whatever, to the point where they're just kind of left standing in the middle of the street drooling. The disconcerting component to this is that some of these people won't recover because the continuing image that has come in since then is of other people coming along later having to help them out of the street so that traffic can be moved, which implies that at least one group is not affected by this. So maybe it's transient, maybe it's localized, as opposed to wide scale. However, the length of time we've seen these images in the data suggests that this will become commonplace enough that a large number of us, perhaps the majority of the population, will have some experience with this. Either they'll be in the situation of driving their car and having some poor fellow standing there stupefied by whatever the hell, or they'll in some way participate with this.
Okay, thank you, Cliff. Dr. Steve, you have a member forum question?
I do. Cliff, since the November tipping point was only your second tipping point, what, if anything, have you learned from it and the 63 days of release language? How does the October 2011 tipping point compare to the two previous ones? Are we still freaking doomed?
Yeah, we're still freaking doomed. I think a lot of the freaking doom, though, will show up before the tipping point. The tipping point in October relative to the one in November is 1/4 to maybe 1/3 in terms of the total